This video is going to be an introduction to Linux for security analysts. We are going through this because this is something that when new people are jumping into security from either getting out of college or coming from maybe an administrative background that doesn't deal with Linux, operating in a Linux operating system tends to be one of these kind of the scary things, right? That everybody kind of avoids. You might have started out as a more of a vulnerability analyst working out of a either like Nessus GUI or Nexpose GUI, and you haven't really had a lot of experience in the command line, and this is going to give you kind of a quick deep dive that you can maybe use as a jumping off point into learning the glories that are that Linux. What we see here is a bash terminal on my Ubuntu operating system, and we're going to kind of jump into this. We're not going to be covering Linux from an administrative perspective, so we're not going to teach you how to admin Linux. We're going to be teaching you more about data manipulation and the power you can have when you're a security analyst, kind of going through data or doing things in the command line. It can make you a lot more efficient at your job, and that's kind of the goal here, is to give you that jump start. So, a couple things before we get started. You may not have access to a Linux operating system. If that's the case, and you don't want to get it installed on your base host, you can certainly use virtualization technology. So we have like VMware Player, which is free, and VirtualBox, which is free. So you can download those, and you can leverage like Ubuntu, Mint, CentOS. These are some free distributions that are friendly. I personally like Ubuntu. There's also Kali Linux, which is another free distribution that has pre-configured a lot of security testing tools. But this is something to get you started. So if you don't have access to a Linux environment, it's not hard. Go ahead and download VirtualBox or VMware Player, and then download Ubuntu or some other distribution that you're comfortable with, and you can install it. There's a lot of tutorials online. DigitalOcean. You Google it. You're gonna come up with a DigitalOcean article on how to do it, and it's really not hard. But to jump into the meat of it. The Linux command line is very powerful. I'm going to show you some examples. At the end of this, we're actually going to show you an example of how to, in one single command, enumerate all the open services from Facebook, right? So it's actually going to be in combination with Shodan, but I'll show you what I mean with that. To get started, there's some basic commands you'll need to understand how to move around. So you have your directory structure, and you maybe just get on a blinking cursor. So you pull open your terminal and you're like, all right, here I am. Now what? There's a blinking cursor in front of me. I don't know what to do. Well, you can check which current working directory you're in with like pwd. You can also list the directory contents with ls. Now this isn't going to list hidden files. You're going to have to append additional command line switches to it, ls switch -la, and you can see that if there were any hidden files. The other thing to keep in mind is if you're not sure about a command, you can always do the man or info page. So if you're like, I know ls does this, but I don't know what switches to use, so you can type man ls, and it will actually give you the manual for ls. And this is where you'll spend a lot of time as you're learning Linux, because the switch operators are very helpful, and it can really change how the command line utility works. And I'm going to show you a bunch of examples where I invoke different switch operators, and you're going to find that, yeah, as you get more and more advanced with the utilities, you're going to be able to leverage them to do and solve additional different problems for you. But you can always go back and read about the utility with the man or the info page. I mean, I always use man. I think info gives you a little more information, but I tend to always just use the man page because that's kind of, yeah, just my preference. So, listing the contents of a directory is very common. Checking which directory you're in is very common. Changing directory with the cd command is also pretty common. You can cd --, brings you up, and then you can check where you're at here, and then you can go back into where you were. So you can kind of move around. You can hit clear. Just give you some examples of some basic moving around the Linux command line. Now you can also have the idea of, if you want to copy a file, just cp sample.pcap. We're going to go through this in a second. You can copy it to 1.cap, and that copies the contents of the sample.cap to 1.cap. So you have it there. If you want to remove that file, rm1.cap. If this were a directory, you would have to rm-rf and then point it to the directory. Again, with those switches, you can go back and you can man rm and read what those switches are, right? So you can see and read a little more about it. There's also the idea of checking file contents. So if you're gonna, when you start to go through, one of the things you'll do as an analyst is you're gonna look through a lot of log files, or a lot of like text documents or pcap files, a lot of stuff, right? So you're gonna very commonly be looking through files and parsing the data. So being able to do that is pretty important. So just the cat command can do that. You can cat multiple files or one file, and we'll just look at the nmap file here that I have. Now, if I just type cat, it's going to blow the screen up, right? And it's going to be hard to really see. Now, there are other additional commands you can use to help you kind of manage the output a little bit better, and it's going to introduce the first concept of pipe, which is going to allow us to run additional command based upon that input. So now we can do pipe dash less, and again, less is going to allow us to page through with the space bar the data, so we can kind of take it as we want. You can also search in here by typing / You can do, search for whatever up, right? And you're going to see that, oh yeah, there's up. And if it was only in a certain line, it would drop you down to that line. If you've paged past it, you got to make sure that you start the command over again, because the search string starts where you are currently in the file. So if you're looking for a match that happened, the file that you've already paged past, it's not going to find it. So you just keep that in mind. And this is an example of like, all right, I'm looking at nmap data. This is an nmap of a /16 for an internal range. And you can kind of start to see that, nmap, when you start to look at any type of log files, or scan data, I mean, you're going to have like hundreds of thousands of lines or millions of lines, easy, right? So, this being able to manipulate things in the command line is going to be very powerful. And I will show you some examples. Before we jump further into that, that'll be later in the video. I'll just discuss a couple quick things. So there's the idea of text editors. If you want to make a file, you have a couple options. You could just do touch file. And you'll see that we have now a file in the that wasn't there prior. We can cat that. It's going to be empty. You can put data into the file, echo test, and it's redirecting my input into the file. And now when we cat the file, we'll see the data's in the input. The data's in the file. You can also use a text editor, whether it be VI or Nano, whatever your preference is. And I'm not going to. Text editors, you got to be quick with them. There can be a lot to it. I would suggest picking a text editor or a couple and reading up on them. But now I'm in the text, the file, and I can start to type, this is a test. And then particularly with Nano, it's just Control X, and then it's saying you want to save it, Y, and the file name file. And you notice I don't have any file extension. Linux isn't too picky about that. If you're not much unlike Windows, but you can always run the file command on the file you're interested in. It will tell you this is an ASCII text file. That's kind of confusing because the file is named file. If you want to rename the file, you can always do the move command, mv, and file.sample.txt, right? So now we gave it a file extension. It doesn't really change anything from our perspective, but now we can run the file command on that, and you can a little more, obvious. Okay, it's an ASCII text file, and that's good. We can run it on the sample, the file command on the sample, and we can see, oh, okay, this is actually a TCP dump capture file, and that gives you an idea. And again, this does not have to have that file extension, so it's not like what it is with Windows, where you have to. It's very picky, fake, right? So like, I can copy this, and that is still, the same TCP dump capture file, right? It's the same thing. The file extension is not a big deal. So we'll remove that. We will remove the file sample. So we've done some, and if you want to make a directory, it's mkdir test, right? So now we made a test directory there, and we can change directory to it. You can put a file in here, and again, you can remove this, go back up. We got to do rm-rf test since it's a directory, and we've kind of removed that. So this is just some basic moving around the command line, creating a file, create a directory. One nice little thing is, as you begin to use Linux, you have the concept of a home directory, which is kind of like your My Documents folder, I guess you could say. With Windows, you can cd tilde, and it'll take you to that home directory, right? You can see that I'm in now home primal, which my username, that's a very common home directory structure for Linux, is home, then the username. And I can actually go back to this other directory by cd dash, and it takes me back to my previous working directory. It's kind of like the last button on your remote. Those are some nice ways. You'll find that you'll have to get to your home directory a lot for certain things. And you'll have to get back to where you were previously for certain things. It's just a little faster to move around. So if you want to check your IP address information, ifconfig, that's a little different than the IP config in the Windows world, but very similar in that sense. You can see you have your IP address, subnet mask information. Obviously, this is an internal IP address. Won't dive too deep into that, but if you need to troubleshoot networking, there's a bunch of stuff online, and you may need to be involved. Setting a static IP address. It's using the ifconfig command, and you can Google that a bit. So the other idea with Linux that's very common is the idea of SSH, right? So You do commonly in Linux SSH around, especially if you're a security analyst, you're going to need to SSH. Very commonly do it on the box, right? You might be working on a Linux workstation, you need to connect to your server. The way you do that is very commonly with SSH. So you SSH, username at IP or domain, and hit that enter, and it will basically try to connect out to that server on the default port. If you need to change the port, switch P, and you may give it a different port, default port 22, and then it'll prompt you for either accepting the SSH keys and or a password, right? So you'll give it that information, log in, and you should be good to go. SCP is a command that is how you move files around using SSH. Very common. If you need to move this, we'll make a test. You need to move this file to a remote server. You can SCP test.txt, and then you would give it, the user at IP : and then you'd give it the path to where you want to put it. So that would be how you would move one local file to the server. If you want to pull a file from a server, you just do SCP : IP path and then to file, and then you can just either point it to another directory on your local system, like the temp directory, or the current working directory with the dot. Right. So SCP is a very important command to learn. SSH is a very important command to learn. I suggest you read up on it. Those are going to be ways that you interact with remote Linux servers. And some Windows servers have SSH servers on it, but it's far less common. But definitely get friendly and have your finger memory on with SSH and SCP, because as you begin to use it, you're going to be using those two things a lot to move around to different systems. Now, the other concept is the idea of privilege level, right? So as you know, in Windows, you have different privilege levels, whether you be a standard user, an admin user, or NT authority system. We have idea of that in Linux too. Just to touch on it real quick, you can check who you are, who am I. That shows me that I'm the username primal. We could check what group membership and what have you I'm in. I'm not going to cover that here, but you can Google how to cat Etsy groups, and you can and how to check what group membership you're in. But if you would like to what's very common when you're working on your workstation, especially just in a lab environment, is you're going to need to run commands that require privilege access. You might have to install something, right? And to do that with the Debian base and Ubuntu, you would be like sudo apt-get install the package name, and Google what you're trying to install and click how to install something in Ubuntu, and it'll come up with how to do that, right? You can use the package manager in the GUI. Apt-get installs is another option for the command line. If you need to run a command with privileged as a privileged user, you can use the idea of sudo, right? It's a sudo command, and it will prompt you for the sudo password for the user. If you need to just elevate to root, you can sudo su, and it will prompt you for your password, assuming you have the appropriate permissions to do that. And I'll just type my password in here, and now I'm root. So now I'll have elevated access to the system in a sense that I can run and install things, I can perform administrative tasks. And you may find yourself, needing to jump into this privilege level to perform some form of action. So, without further ado, that was a pretty quick, real fast crash course into moving around Linux. You're going to need to do a little bit of homework on your own and Google around and take some tutorials. That was just me trying to give you like a smash and grab approach. But now to kind of hopefully show you some of the power, I'm going to give you some examples, and hopefully that gives you some idea as to why use Linux over Windows. For security analysis. So the first example we have here is with a TCP dump file, as we looked at a second ago when we were running the file command. TCP dump is another Linux utility. It's pretty awesome, and it gives you the ability to capture and read binary PCAP data. So, which is essentially network traffic data that is either happening via a network tap, and you may be looking at an entire network or a segment of a network, or you may be just looking at your local host if you run it on your local host. But in any event, if we were to run this is going to be one of those things where, again, blows up my screen, right? Because I didn't provide it any way to page through and manage the output. I'm going to use less. And we can kind of see that this is a pretty big file. If we're curious as to how big the file is, we can use the WC-L word count. It looks like we have this many lines. Significantly large file. Would be hard to go through and digest this, especially if you've never looked at PCAP. You're like, what am I looking at here? The matrix? What is all this stuff going on? Well, I can show you guys a little bit about how to leverage Linux command line for this to analyze PCAP. I'll just show you some quick examples. One of the things you commonly do when you're looking at network traffic from a security analyst perspective, in my experience, is to take a look at DNS. DNS could be a treasure trove of information, and you can do this by a combination of BPF filters and grep utility. I haven't even talked about grep yet. Wow, grep's the holy grail of Linux utilities when you're talking about searching through data, right? As a security analyst. Well, grep is basically, it searches for a particular search string, right? So you can do regex, you can do, in this instance, I'm literally just doing a question mark, and I'm basically focusing in this example, I'm going to basically say, okay, go ahead and read the PCAP file, only show me UDP packets, and only show me packets that are UDP in port 53, which is commonly associated with DNS traffic. There may be other traffic on those ports, but that's generally what DNS runs on. And then you have question mark A equals is for host A lookup, and we can take a look at what this looks like, right? So these are all the DNS queries that occurred in that PCAP file. It's much easier to digest. Now, in a real world, you're going to have thousands and thousands and thousands, millions of these entries potentially. So it won't even fit on this one screen, and it's going to be hard for you to digest. Okay, how do I go through all this data? Well, Linux provides you some cool utilities to help you summarize data, which I think is really the power of Linux for security analysts. So the next thing we can do here is we can, again, continually pipe commands to it to change the output, which is awesome. So so we have this is our current output. Take a look at this, and now what we want to do is summarize an item of interest in this text data here. Now the item of interest from my perspective is going to be this domain name that's looked up. You might also be interested in what name servers are being leveraged. That's also sometimes interesting. In this instance, we can see it looks like it's Google, and I forget who 422 is. I think that's a college. But in any event, the domain name that's being looked up is interesting, right? Especially because malware phones home. You want to try to find domain names that might be associated with malware or other malicious activity, and that can be a good place to start your hunt. So to do that, at least one of the things I do is I'll leverage, like I see here, the grep command, and I'll start to implement the awk command. Now, awk is a great utility that can do a whole lot, right? It's a very powerful utility. I leverage it pretty simply, just to print an element of a line based upon a delimiter. Now, the way it works is our output is essentially broken into, I will show you here, the default delimiter for awk is spaces. So this is element 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and so on. Now, you can also do NF in awk is the last element in the line, right? So NF, and NF minus 1 is the second to last element in the line, which is why you saw in the previous command, I was printing awk print NF minus 1. So I was saying, hey, awk, just grab me the second to last element of the line based on a space delimiter, and we have it right here. It's the domain name. So let's see if that works. So print awk. Oop, looks like I had the wrong string copied. And then we'll just see if that worked. Right, excellent. So now we just grabbed that item that was interesting to us, and now we can go ahead and summarize it further by appending additional commands. So we can run the sort unique C, unique-C, and then I do sort unique, and I'll explain what this is, -nr. So I'm first sorting to unique it, because in order to unique it, you need to sort it. Now that sounds confusing, but what I want to basically do is, instead of showing all the duplicate entries in the DNS, I want to say, okay, show me how many times each occurred just once. So if something occurred 20 times in there, just show me the string, and then it occurred 20 times, so I can start to summarize the output a little further, so it's not showing me at 20 instances of it, just showing me, hey, this occurred 20 times. Then NR is basically saying, put it in sort it by number, reverse order, so it's going to put the highest occurrence at the top and the lowest at the bottom, and then we'll kind of see this right here, right? So in this instance, you can see, okay, so this was looked up twice, and again, this is a kind of a very small data set in real-world DNS. You have hundreds of thousands of lookups. I mean, millions. I mean, it's astronomically high, and being able to do this allows you to kind of really go through and look at the data a lot faster. And you can also do certain things with egrep. I can basically say, okay, I don't care about anything that has this string in it. So I can now do egrep switch V, which basically says don't show me anything with the string in it. And pipe this through less again, and now I'm going to have that output removed okay, I know that this is, I don't care about this output, and you can pipe, don't show me that or that. And you may have to escape out certain characters. This will be treated as a wildcard character. If you do escape it out, it will be treated exactly as a dot. And then now that's no longer there, right? So as you start, that's kind of what I'll do is I'll actually build a pretty huge egrep up as I'm going through DNS data and just start to peel back the onion on what I can explain, and then look at what's there and investigate those domains that are there. And that's kind of an example of how I would continually leverage these Linux utilities to summarize data that was starting out looking pretty bad from my point of view. So yeah, that's one example that's pretty powerful. You can apply the same approach to SYNs with network traffic, and the interesting thing there is SYNs are going to show you connection attempts. So just like one of the first things that a system's going to do from a malware connection perspective is very often we'll make a DNS query, and then if it resolves, it will make a connection attempt out to that malicious domain. So looking at the SYNs can be interesting. TCP 13 equals 2 is a BPF filter that basically tells TCP dump to look for SYNs, 13th offset header in the TCP packet for a value of 2, which is a SYN flag. So that's going to show me here that, hey, these are my SYN packets. And again, on a real world example, these would be huge. It's going to be output that's going to just blow your screen up for forever, and you're not going to be able to look at it very easily unless you summarize it. So one of the ways you can summarize it is looking for the since these are all SYN connections, it's very common that you're going to see SYNs, outbound SYNs. You can do some additional BPF filters to ensure that, but in this example, based on the placement of the capture, we're looking at outbound SYNs. It doesn't see the inbound SYNs. And we're going to see, okay, so this element in the line is what we're interested in that we want to summarize. Much like the domain, this is the element we want to look at now for the SYNs, which happens to be the 6th element in the line based upon a space delimiter. Now you can change the delineator. So if I say, oh, I want to split the line up based on this character here, you can do that. You can say awk switch capital F, which makes it very powerful, because then you can really start to slice and dice data up that may not, not necessarily based on the spaces, because sometimes you don't have spaces in the output. You want to split up. You may only have commas, right, in a CSV. Maybe you want to split it by the comma. So it all depends on your output, but spaces may not be a good way to do it. So that you can change that with awk and just tell it to switch F will change the delimiter. You can see that, okay, the first element of the line here was the first half of that in front of that caret symbol. The second half would be the second portion. But in this instance, we're actually fine using the default value for awk, so we can go ahead and delete it and use spaces and awk print 6, which is going to be our system that we were trying to make a SYN out to, right? That are in our PCAP file, and then we can again do the same sort unique -c sort switch nr, and I had a typo. There we go. So we can start to see, again, same approach. I can see, hey, we reached out to this server on port 80. This server port 80, you can start to see, like, all right, peel back the onion on this a little bit. If you want to, there's additional, if you want to clean the output up, there's instances where you may want to change a particular value to something else or completely remove that. Set is a really cool utility for that. So if I want to get rid of this little semicolon just because I'm being weird and I don't like it, I can basically escape out the semicolon and use this sed command. Now what I'm basically saying here is the sed basically says, okay, replace this value we see here with this value in between these brackets. Now the value is nothing, so it will remove it, right? So you can see now no longer the semicolon's there, the colon's there. Now if I do this, it's now going to change it to this, right? So you can see the streamlined text editor is really nice if you need to do something. I commonly find myself removing text or cleaning text up with this, but you could also, there's a lot of use cases for sed, and as you start to learn the utilities more and more and more, you'll start to leverage what you like and what works for you. Okay, so that's some quick and dirty examples of the PCAP file. Now let's take a look at Nmap. If you're a security tester, one of the common things you're going to do is for kickoff an Nmap scam, you get started, and then you're going to have to take that data and potentially leverage it in another tool. Good example of that is parsing for open web services, and then building URLs, and then passing those URLs to another tool, like WhatWeb or Eyewitness. Eyewitness actually parses Nmap data for you, so it's a bad example, but WhatWeb is a good example where, hey, I want to run a WhatWeb utility, which goes out there and just makes a head request to the server if you do -A1, and it will attempt to extract the tech stack for you. So you can just cat and grep for Cold Fusion, Joomla, Drupal, whatever your technology stack when you're doing your assessment to try to dive in a little deeper. But the way to do that, one way to do that is by catting the file. So we can do our sample mmap file, and let's take a look at it again. We looked at it a second ago, but you can see here. So now what's interesting to us is going to be anything that has 80 open or common web ports. We can start to build out. We can see this has 80, 80, 80, and some other 9998. So you can see there's some web ports in here, but just for proof of concept purposes, I'm going to show you how to extract, all right, if you want to build HTTP URLs, and how to do that. So we would grep for 80 open. I'm escaping out the / to make sure it treats it as exactly the string, because certain characters have special meaning in the bash command on Linux command line, so you have to escape them out. So you're telling it that hey, use it as a string, not special character. And we can see, okay, let's grep for that. Okay, so what we're seeing is everything that we see here has 80 open, right? So now we know that these things have 80 open. We can actually grab the second element of the line, which is the IP address, and then build a URL structure for it, knowing that it has 80 open. We may do the same thing for 443, and I'll show you that. So we can, again, we're going to leverage the awk command, introduce a little bit of a new concept that we haven't shown you. But we can awk print 2, and we have confidence that these IPs have 80 open. So now what do? You could use sed to format that new URL, or you could also just do something a little easier and just print your URL structure in here. As you can see, boom, we got URLs. And I can pipe this to a file, urls 80.txt, boom, and cat urls 80.txt, and that's ready to go for another file, right? So that's an example. You can do the same thing for 443. We would just change this to HTTPS and change this to 443 open, and that's boom, ready to go into the file. We can do the same thing for 8443, which is an HTTP alternative port, and that's where you would, in this instance, :8443, and we would grep for 8443, boom, and cat urls 844. Let's see, I don't even know if there's anything in there that had that port. Oh, there are a couple things. Okay. And then if you want to cat them all, you can, again, like I said, you can cat multiple files together. You can just cat URL stars, right? So I know all my URL files. There's 3 files there, so I can just cat URL star, and I can see them all. Boom, 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 boom. And I could then feed this into another file if I wanted to. All urls.txt, and then that's ready to go for another tool, right? So that's an example of how I'm searching mmap, parsing mmap, building another file, input file for another tool. Very common use case. You're going to do that a boatload of times in your security testing work realm. Just an example, and a pretty good one, pretty usable one. You're going to definitely leverage that a lot. So now the next thing is, all these concepts are pretty cool, and you can get very, very complex with it. There is a whole bunch you can do in Linux world. One of the things that you'll find yourself doing is having to do a command over and over again. You can do the bash for loop. So you could do like for I in, we do cat all URLs, semicolon, do, and you're going to do your command. So your command can be wget $I, done. And basically what that's going to do is it's going to go through all the URLs in that file based upon each URL being a new line, and then run wget across it, because it's now assigning each line to the variable I, and done. So that would be a way you could wget all those URLs at once. You may do this with a command that or tool that does not allow you to provide an input file. It only allows you to take like one URL as input or one IP as input, and this can be a good little for loop that can speed things up for you. Now I'm going to show you a really complex example of where we would basically, I have a file here that I downloaded from Hurricane Electric that has the BGP routing information for Facebook, so it's got all Facebook's like network ranges. And what we can do is actually cat that file, use some fancy grep kung fu to extract the ranges, and then pass it to a shodan command and look up, I'll explain it. So cat the file here. This stuff here is basically parsing the HTML out using some of the techniques I already showed you. Long story short is I just kind of built out the command, I got a grep for net. Okay, now href. Now grep for this string, and they got me to the line that I'm interested in that has all the IPs in it. Now grep and separate the line by /net/ print the second element in the line, then separate the line by this character's here, and print the first one. Long story short, that got the network range out of the HTML. Everything's going to be different, but as you start to look through HTML, you'll figure out like what strings to parse, how to do that. I pipe that to a file, and then I append a new command to run with the and signs, and then I for I in, that little for loop I showed you, cat the Facebook ranges file we just created, and do showdan's command. The showdan command is showdan space download, and then it's going to give it a file name, which I appended $I results, and search for net : $I. So basically saying, search showdan for this network range, download the data to a file that has the network range _ results. Let's see if this works. This does take a long time to run. Let's see if I can see data coming in here. And I just pause it here. So what we're seeing here now is that it's starting to reach out to Shodan and pull down the files. This will take a little bit of time to run, but as you let it sit here, it'll run, and it should finish fairly quickly. Shodan's API, in my experience, has some hit or miss. Sometimes it'll be running really slowly, and sometimes it looks like right now it is. But this is an example of where we're basically, so you're saying it's unresponsive at the moment. So I think something's hammering Shodan API, but generally it's much faster than this. And this is just an example of the command where you can run it and it's going to go through and do something kind of complex, right? So we built this simple bash command up, and now it's no longer you know what it is? My API key is querying Shodan already from another box. That's exactly what's happening. So in any event, that's that. That's an example of how you would do a very complex command, and hopefully it's inspired you to jump into Linux and learn it. If anything, just for the text manipulation purposes and automation purposes. It's very powerful. There's tons. We've only scratched the surface in this video, but hopefully it's inspired you to learn a little more. And that's it.